So once again, this video is probably going to be a little bit in and out, largely because I've got my Google Meet open and then I've also got my email open. So if I have a student that sort of walks into my virtual classroom, I have to stop the video and talk to them. So just be aware I may be stopping the video off and on. Today we are talking about chapter 4 of The Great Gatsby, which to me is pretty apropos considering everything that's going on right now. You know, it's funny, there are all of these memes that are out of people talking about like, oh, you wanted everything to be like the roaring 20s again. Okay, so here's your plague and here's, you know, everything shutting down and here's your economic crisis and everything like that. So it is what it is. So it's kind of funny that we see this again cycle. We've talked about that before, right? And like the philosophical term for it's the Hegelian dialectic, Marxist Hegelian dialectic if you want, for my AP and AP Lang and AP Lit kids. But for everyone else, it's that pendulum that we keep talking about, the idea that as a society and as individuals, we keep swinging back into Plato's cave, right? The cave of ignorance. So we start off with this concept of the world that is the sort of seedy underbelly, and then the world of the pristine. So it says, on Sunday morning while church bells rang in the villages along shore, the world and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. So meaning that while all of these people are going to church and doing what they're supposed to do, moralistically speaking, there's the real world and there's Gatsby's world. And one of the things that I haven't touched on yet, and it really didn't become that pertinent until this particular chapter, is the idea of West Egg versus East Egg. So East Egg is old money, and the way that you remember it is the E for East Egg is a vowel, and old starts with a vowel too. So East Egg is old money, West Egg is new money. So East Egg would be people like the sugar barons and the people who came over from England with money and settled here. And then West Egg would be like the people with new money. So people who made money either through war profiteering or through, in some cases, like Gatsby's accused of being a bootlegger, or through sort of seedy underbelly aspects of life. Make sure I keep my timer here so I don't run out of memory. So there is this listing in the beginning of chapter 4 of all of these different party guests. And it's kind of comical, but he being Nick Carraway, lists their misbehavior to emphasize the darkness of this wealthy, carefree lifestyle. So if you look at all of the names that he lists, they're all very animalistic. So like Dr. Webster civet, like a civet's like a ferret-like animal that's used to make fur coats. And then it's got black buck, which is an animal. And then he says flipped up their noses like goats. And then, or rather, Hubert Arbach and Mr. Christie's wife, meaning that they're cheating. And then he goes further and he talks about all of these different like fish, like whitebait, hammerheads, flink, belugas, right? So that's that whole reference to the crazy fish that he talks about at the very beginning. And then he goes further and he talks about orchids and catlips and lilies and plants. So it's basically what he's saying is like all of these people that are supposed to be very like rich and wealthy and like you're supposed to hold them up on this pedestal are actually kind of animalistic. Like they're the flora and fauna, like they're base, they're animalistic, going back to that whole thing about like Tom is supposed to be civilized, but like being civilized means that you're not racist or sexist or like you beat people up or anything like that, right? So the implication here is that these people are being, you know, more civilized by having these crazy parties, but in the crazy parties, they're acting uncivilized. And then it goes further and talks about the idea of plants like duckweed and then bull, like Francis Bull. And then he says palmetto, which again is a plant, who killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. So he ends a paragraph, Nick Carraway ends a paragraph on like, oh yeah, and he committed suicide, like no biggie, whatever, right? And then he goes further and talks about these 4 girls. Yeah, so in addition to all these, I can remember that Faustina O'Brien came there at least once, and the Bedecker girls and Young Brewer, right? So he keeps listing all of these, you know, names to sort of give this like overwhelming aspect of just how many people are involved with Gatsby. And it actually becomes important later to see how very isolating Gatsby is. So to give you a comparison, this would be like looking at someone's Instagram page or their Twitter or their TikToks or whatever and seeing like thousands and thousands of views and likes. This is what Gatsby is. Gatsby is Insta famous. Gatsby is TikTok famous. Gatsby is, he's the new type of celebrity. So all of these people are all about Gatsby and all about his life, but they don't know where he got his money. They don't know where he came from. There are all of these like sort of seedy insinuations about who he is, but he's projected this platonic conception of himself, much like we do on our social media platforms, and people are buying into it. People believe it and they want to see that as part of who he is, right? And so he's got who he authentically is, which we actually see in a moment when he's on the car ride with Nick Carraway. He like lets slip his authentic self for just a moment, and then immediately slips back into character. But he projects himself this particular way. So it's almost like people want the fantasy. They want the fantasy of Gatsby. They want not James Gatz. Remember, that's who he is James Gatz, but they want the Gatsby, right? And this chapter is the devolving of the understanding of that platonic conception, right? And I keep saying the word platonic conception, but if you haven't grasped it now, the platonic conception is the avatar that James Gatz, who's Gatsby, James Gatz is putting out there. His actual name is James Gatz, but he's invented a new identity for himself, okay? And his new identity is J, just letter J, so he's stripped that old part of himself, the James part of himself, and then Gatsby, so he's being the most Gatz he possibly can. He's projecting himself into this state of like statuesque perfection. But we've seen what happens, right? We've seen what happens in social media when people project this perfection of themselves. It can't last, right? They have mental breakdowns and they, become overwhelmed, and they at some point in time are going to make someone upset or angry and feel the need to like talk about it, right? So we then further find out that they are going on this, Gatsby and Nick Carraway are going on this like luncheon, right? And we're greeted once again. James Gatsby greets Nick Carraway by saying, "Good morning, old sports. Remember, this is all a game to him. You're having lunch with me today and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with a resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, even more with the formless grace of a nervous sporadic games. So Nick is observing that Americans have an absence of hard labor, what used to define Americans, and instead now Americans have this construct of like life as a child is a game. So I actually, Miss DeWeese gave me this book talking about the idea of childhood out throughout America. And one of the things that really interested me is the idea of having a childhood where you get to be kind of innocent and play and not have any cares or worries is actually a fairly modern construct. So it used to be that the more children you had, the more people that you would have to work on the farm or work in the factory or help contribute to, the household income and help take care of people. But as we as Americans became wealthier and able to have a little bit more financial stability, there was this idea of preserving the childhood and preserving the innocence of childhood. And so that aspect of like removing work and removing responsibility and removing family obligation became a focal point of new parenting, right? So now your job as a child is to just go to school and play and be innocent, right? That's actually a fairly modern idea. And so what Nick Carraway is observing is that that idea is a very American optimistic idea. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that there is the debate that's happening within this novel is that like, yes, capitalism exists, and yes, capitalism is a part of the American dream, and yes, capitalism is problematic. However, one of the things that keeps us moving progressing as Americans is this idea of having a goal, of having something to achieve, right? So that's an aspect of this debate as well. So does Gatsby create this like self and non-self? Yes, he absolutely does. And is it false? Yes, it absolutely is, but it gives him purpose, right? Because if we don't have purpose, what else happens to us? You know, that's a debate too. Remember, the transcendentalist basically said, like, you don't need purpose. Nietzsche says you don't need purpose. If you can just exist, that's okay. And that's the whole idea of optimistic nihilism. Once again, like, for those of you that are Rick and Morty fans, like, that's what they talk about. Like, you don't need to go and save the world, right? So, alright, so I'm going to stop the video there and just upload it so that I don't run out of memory, and then I'll come back and we'll actually get into the drive that they're having, and we'll talk about. So let's get into the drive. So we have this conversation with Nick. The car is described in all of these sort of mirroring terms. It's like cream colored, right? So it's like pure, but not quite pure. It's got green on the inside. So the green is supposed to represent like comfort and desire and luxury and greed and all of those things. And then there's this like, it says terrace with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. So it's like there's the natural world of the sun, and then there's this dazzling thing that is trying to imitate the sun. You know, so there's a very famous quote, and I don't remember who it's by, but that basically says that all art is simply an imitation of nature. So this particular car is supposed to mirror the idea of like God and power. And Ozzy, stop. My son's being bad. So anyway, the car ends up being sort of, it foreshadows something to come. For those of you that have finished the book, you'll know. But towards the end of page 64, it says, so my first impression that he was a person of some undefined consequence, and had gradually faded and had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door, right? So he knows that Gatsby's fate is coming, and it has to do with this car, right? Notice too that his suit is the same color as the car. And then Gatsby, during this ride with Nick, starts creating his own truth, and Nick is kind of testing the boundaries of it. So, for example, I'll tell you God's truth. Notice that he says God's truth, right? So for Gatsby, God's truth is the truth that he's creating, because this is his platonic conception of self, right? I'll tell you God's truth. His right hand suddenly ordered the divine retribution that I stand by. Hang on, Ozzy, no. I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West. Now, it's interesting that he chose the Middle West, right? Because the Middle West is supposed to be where Nick Carraway is from. So Nick Carraway can actually test him on this a little bit. And he says, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford. So it's important that he throws that educated at Oxford thing, right? Because it's just like if you were to say, oh, I went to Yale or I went to Harvard or whatever it is, right? So for him, it's not only here is this prestigious university that I attended, but it's not an American university, it's an English university. So it's like even better, right? Or swallowed it or choked on it as though it had bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. So Nick is starting to get suspicious, right? He's starting to understand that Gatsby is lying about his past, and so there's a little bit more corruption in there. And then Nick goes, what part of the Middle West? Gatsby replies, San Francisco. I see. The I see is actually ironically, because he does see, Nick does see. He sees through Gatsby. Because remember, Nick is from the Middle West, and San Francisco is not the Middle West. San Francisco is California, right? So he is aware for a moment that like this whole persona that he's about to be fed is going to be false. For a moment, I suspected he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. So he believes, Gatsby truly believes what he's saying is true. Like he truly believes in his own perception of self, right? He's making that thing true for himself. Then on page 66, we find out this story that Gatsby tells about the war. And it's an important story, and we don't know if it's true or not true, but the main point of the story is this. It's significant that Gatsby achieves social advancement through the military. So in 1840, Tocqueville's Democracy in America, it's a book, argued that aristocracy uses military rank to reflect social rank, okay? So democratic armies meant that no matter where you came from, if you were poor, if you were rich, if you were an immigrant, whatever your race was, you could actually rise up through the lower classes. And remember, that's a Marxist idea. That Marxist idea is what we call stratification. So I'll say it again, it's called stratification. Okay, so stratification basically argues that poor people can rise through social rank, and one Marxist theory says that democratic nations strive for peace, but war itself actually makes a better social mobility for poor people. So if you're poor and you get into the military and you're really, really good at being in the military, whether that's killing people or just being like a general and bossing people around and being a good leader, whatever that is, that will help you rise through the rank. And that in and of itself brings this whole ethical question, you know, like, should a democracy and social mobility that we claim actually happens, should it be based on war? You know, so you guys can go, and again, I'm not telling you to think anything. I am presenting an argument to you. In fact, if I say something that you disagree with, that's actually a really good sign. That means that you've got some opinion, and you should have opinion about these things. But one of the arguments that exists about the idea of capitalism and the problems of capitalism is that if you have military that basically offers free college, free job, like not free job, but like free lifetime opportunity for job advancement, healthcare, all of those things, then basically what you're arguing is that if you are poor and you want to rise in social rank, we as a country need to be at war. All right, that's a huge oversimplification of a more complex argument, but I don't have time to kind of get into that argument. If you're interested in it, you should look up the term Marxist stratification and then plus, right, for the Boolean string, plus military advancement, because there's a whole bunch of argument about why this is problematic. I don't know that it necessarily is. My opinion doesn't really matter. You need to come at that with your own opinion and like what you feel about that. I come from a military family, so I guess you can kind of guess what my opinion is. So then he talks about this medal, and medal is actually legitimate, right? It was a common medal from World War I, and he slips into this storytelling of the past in which Nick Carraway is like kind of believes him and kind of doesn't believe him, and we as readers kind of believe him and kind of don't believe him because of Nick, right? Which, by the way, I keep bringing up all of this stuff about Marcel Proust and the Proustian metaphor, and listen, if you want to read Marcel Proust like Swan's Way, do it. But it's a lot. I'm warning you, it's a lot. Like, even I, as a philosophy minor, was like, I had to have one of my professors, Dr. Morgan, kind of walk me through like how it's applicable to literature and language. And recently, this book was actually published. It's called Proust and the Squid. If you're interested in this kind of inception idea of reading and how it affects the way that we understand metaphor and the Proustian Madeline, which is the forever unfolding and like Saussure and things like that, I strongly, strongly, strongly urge you to read this one. There's also another book by Robert Mendelssohn called The Way That We Read, and that's it's almost always like one of the top things that you see in Barnes & Noble that's like recommended by people who love books. So that book and this book are really good ways for you to understand Proustian metaphor and like the sort of understanding of what happens when we read, neurologically speaking. So when I start talking about all of this Proust stuff, if that's something that you want to get nerdy about, I strongly suggest that you do that. So top of page 68, he wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. So the closer that he gets to the proximity of the city, the more he starts re-adopting the Gatsby, right? He's re-adopting this like Platonic conception of himself. And then as they're driving past the Valley of Ashes, it says, then the Valley of Ashes opened out on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Mrs. Wilson. So notice again, she's not Myrtle anymore. She's Mrs. Wilson. She's someone else's property, straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by. So everything else in the Valley of Ashes is dead except for Myrtle, right? Which for those of you that have read the book or seen the movie, you know why that's ironic and how that is also foreshadowing. It could also be, so some people argue that this particular scene with the Valley of Ashes is where we see Myrtle as the temptress. And this whole chapter for me, like if you look at my book, this whole chapter's got lots of pink in it, because that was my feminist critique. This whole chapter for me, if you were to approach this with a feminist lens, is very problematic, because we have this beginning of Gatsby and he like sets the tone for himself, but the only real reason that he's setting the tone for himself is to create this platonic conception to get the girl. And the whole idea of the getting the girl, while it could be considered a romantic notion, is also an objectification. Like, she's not a trophy. She is not an emerald that you like pluck out of the water. And it's problematic if we, you know, as people or readers even, view Myrtle and Daisy as simply objects. And so this one instance where it says Mrs. Wilson straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by, so she's the temptress basically, right? She's supposed to be the one that the piece of life that's standing out amongst death. All right, so I'm going to stop the video here and I'll pick it up in part 2.